To the narrow question of the comparison between P3s and traditionally procured and financed projects, the so-called public sector comparator, there's a number of problems with these assessments that are done, these value for money assessments. The first one is the nature and the timing of the comparison that's done. What's done typically in these studies, at least we saw for Sea to Sky and RAV, is an analysis after the P3 contract was concluded. So this isn't a forward-looking decision-making analysis. This is a justification for a decision that's already been made. It's problematic in its own right. But it also compares the costs that are defined in a contract, the P3, with a hypothetical circumstance of a public sector comparator, a traditionally procured project that doesn't exist. So your benchmark, your key benchmark, is an abstraction, is a hypothetical, and it's compared to an actual contract. And that's very problematic. And the RAV value for money assessment really illustrates it well. In the RAV study, what they concluded was, actually it was the same in the Sea to Sky, the present value costs of the P3 were over $100 million more than the traditionally procured and financed hypothetical public sector comparator. But what they said was the station design and the frequency of service with the P3 would result in 34% more ridership than what you'd get if the government did it. Now, this is very bizarre to me because in both cases, TransLink is operating the service. So what they're saying with, in the contract, where they've worked very closely with SNC-Lavalin, figure out the station design, how many steps you have to go down to get to the station, where they're located, how much service will be offered, they realized they could do better than what they had originally thought. And that's why they have this higher ridership with the P3. But for some reason, in the hypothetical public sector comparator, same people operating the system, it's going to be TransLink that's running the service, those additional riders wouldn't appear. So you have a comparison that shows a marginal benefit for the P3, but it's based on an assumption that you're getting all this extra riders if you have the private sector design, build, and operate the facility, TransLink running the service, as compared to TransLink or the provincial government entering into a design build contract, operating and maintaining the system, and financing it itself. Very problematic comparison. You have to take these value for money assessments and recognize that they're not comparing apples with apples, they're comparing a contract with a hypothetical.
So where are we on the P3 radar screen? Well, we're quite slow, Canada. I'm always quite hesitant to try new things. But to give you an idea of how big capital spending is in Canada, $17 billion if you look at capital spending by provincial and federal government, and just 1 year, $17 billion goes towards capital spending.
More fundamental problem is the valuation of risk. A major issue, if you like, in value for money assessments is the value of the risk that's transferred to the private sector in P3s that wouldn't be transferred under a traditionally procured project. So in the Sea to Sky evaluation, they assumed that the benefits of the risk transfer, the additional risk that the private sector takes on, would be some $80 million. In the RAV project, it was $240 million. And it's a bunch of magic as to how they get those numbers. And they also assume that some of that risk benefit couldn't be achieved in a traditional model. Bear in mind, these projects, and I'm thinking of highway projects and rapid transit in particular, are built by the private sector. They're built under contract with government, in either case. And if you wanted to fix the price, you could do that in a traditionally procured project. If you have to decide what risks you want to fix, you don't fix all risks. You fix those risks that you think the private sector can manage better than you can. But there's not a great reason why you need to have the private sector finance the project to transfer a lot of risk, in particular the risk of cost overruns, the risk of performance. You can have warranties on performance, you can have bonds on performance. We do this all the time.
And understand in British Columbia why P3s are such a big idea or been talked about so often is in 2002, the BC Liberals came out with what they call the Capital Asset Management Framework. This was based upon the example in Australia, and Partnerships BC was established, which Dr. Shaffer mentioned a few times, and it was modeled on the experience of the state of Queensland, I believe, Partnerships Victoria. And we've had a few projects come up with that. Of course, the Abbotsford Hospital being one of the biggest. It's the first time BC has seen a new hospital in over a generation.
Another issue with the value for money assessments, and this is particularly true of Sea to Sky more so than the RAV project, the one that was done by Partnerships BC, is the assumed cost of capital. You know, a major benefit, I mean, one thing that government does well, and I'm the first to admit that government does not, and you have to work for government to know that government does not do many things well. But one of the things it does do well is borrow money. And the reason I say that is it's a very safe creditor. People like loaning money to the government. In fact, if you talk to people at the Municipal Financing Authority, they talk about liquidity. What do they mean? They want to have more debt out there because then they can get lower rates because people can trade it better in the marketplace. Governments get very low, very attractive financing rates. So when we go to a privately financed highway or a privately financed RAV project in part, we're giving up the benefit of that low cost, that low interest rate. Yet in the value for money assessment of the Sea to Sky project, what Partnerships BC did is make the assumption that regardless of what the actual interest rate government would pay in its traditionally procured project, it's going to assume it's the exact same cost as the cost of capital that the private sector incurs, which in that particular case was 7.5%. And in the case of the traditional government financing right now, I don't know the exact rates, but I'm pretty sure it'd be 5% or less, which makes a huge difference. These are capital projects. It's all about the interest rates. And when you talk about another 2.5 percentage points on a $500 or $600 million project, you're talking $10 million a year or more. The private sector needs to worry about what's called contract risk. They'll run into governments that won't pay or want to change the rules. They have to build in an extra return for that. The private sector needs a return on the equity that it puts in, comparable to the return it could earn in investments around the world. Public sector doesn't need that. In other words, in this value for money assessment, there was a bias against the public sector comparator by ignoring the benefit of public financing.
So Quebec is following BC. They're setting up a very similar operation to Partnerships BC. Ontario has an infrastructure program and policy involving the private sector. Municipalities have been doing P3s for a long time. Why have they been doing it for a long time? Because generally municipalities don't have the borrowing capacity that provincial and federal governments do. New Brunswick has a P3 policy. We have a federal policy in place as well. Again, P3s generally aren't anything new. It's just more or less the terminology.
And the final point, and it's very much related to this, is the weighting of future costs. In technical terms, the discount rate, the discounting of future costs. When we enter into a P3 or even into debt service, we're imposing obligations on taxpayers for the next 25 years. And the question is, what weight do we give to the payments 25 years from now? And in the value for money assessments that Partnerships BC has done, they give relatively little weight. They use the time value of money that the private sector needs, based on the rate of return that it could earn, not the interest rate that taxpayers face, the weight that we would want to give to the imposition, the liabilities we're imposing on future generation. So just to give you a sense of the importance of this, using the discount rate that Partnership BC used, the weighting that it gave to future costs, the present value cost of the Sea to Sky project, operating and maintenance costs, construction, everything, was $790 million. If you use a discount rate that reflects government's borrowing rate, something that would give you an equivalent present value from a taxpayer point of view, the cost is $1 billion. And if you just added up the cost, what is it that we're going to be spending over the next 25 years on this project? It's almost $2 billion. So this really matters. We have to really consider the weight that we attach to future expenditures.